Chapter 100 Clear Conscience. The Black Knight remained motionless for several minutes, silently observing the corpses of his enemies. Drops of blood fell from the blade of his fearsome great sword, gathering into a puddle beneath his feet. The thoughts of the cruel creature were a mystery. To be honest, Sonny wasn't even sure that this unstoppable mountain of murderous black steel was sentient. In that regard, the monstrous inhabitants of the cursed city were a bit strange. Usually, nightmare creatures of higher classes possessed a perverse form of intelligence, which was often comparable to that of humans, and sometimes even surpassed it. However, that rule did not apply to every monster in this eerie place. From Sonny's observations, the dwellers of the ruined city could be roughly divided into two groups. The first group consisted of various creatures that came here from outside the wall, be it from the labyrinth or from the depths of the dark sea. These abominable things more or less followed the unnatural laws of the spell that every awakened was familiar with. The second group was different. These creatures, he suspected, were either created from the remains of the ancient residents of the city or, creepily, had actually been them once. The wraiths, as he called them, were much more unfathomable and dangerous. Their powers and behavior refused to abide by any sort of sense or logic. The Black Knight was one of these sinister revenants. That's why Sonny had trouble predicting his actions. Most of the time, the regal devil was content simply patrolling the grand hall of the ruined cathedral and killing anything that dared to come inside. Just like he had killed those poor fools. With a sigh, Sonny lay down on top of the support beam and, not paying any attention to the deadly height of his improvised resting spot, closed his eyes. He wanted to take a breath before continuing with his nightly errands. Soon, the sound of heavy footsteps informed him that the bastard had resumed his never-ending patrol. Good riddance. Despite the fact that nothing was disturbing his peace anymore, Sonny still felt strangely restless. His inner voice was in the mood to chat. Sonny. Aren't you forgetting something? He frowned. What was there to forget? He was just catching his breath before going out again. He also had to wait for the right moment to scavenge through the possessions of these dead hunters. You just killed 6 people. Don't you feel guilty? Sonny was a little startled by this question. Curious, he listened to his emotions and came to the conclusion that no, he did not feel guilty at all. This was his 3rd time killing a human being. Granted, the first time happened inside a nightmare, where people were supposed to be simple illusions. However, Sonny wasn't sure that he believed in this theory. The old slaver's anguish had felt awfully real to be just a figment of his imagination. The second time, well, he didn't want to think about that. That happened in the castle, anyway, and that part of his life was over. The 3rd time was the cleanest of them all. Those thugs were going to rob and kill him, anyway. Sonny had seen through their intentions long before pulling on the invisible string and sending their leader into the cold embrace of death. He could have tried to run away, but they were very rude. If the thugs had insulted just him, Sonny might have tried to end the confrontation without bloodshed. However, they insulted Nephi's. Bastards deserved to die. Despite the fact that his relationship with Changing Star had become strained, he still cared about her a great deal. Leaving the castle did not mean that he had forgotten their friendship. It's just that there were more reasons to leave than to stay. With a sigh, Sonny summoned the beautiful bottle made out of patterned blue glass. This was the farewell gift that Cassie had given him before their parting. He cherished this memory very much. Bringing the bottle to his lips, Sonny took several sips of cold, delicious water and opened his eyes. He didn't want to rest anymore. Better to get moving. Before venturing out again, Sonny returned to his room and walked over to a large iron chest that was standing in one of its corners. Exerting some strength, he lifted the heavy lid and admired his treasure pile. Inside the chest, more than 100 beautiful soul shards were glowing softly in the dark. The sight of them always lifted Sonny's mood. Despite the fact that he himself had no use for the soul shards, they were still a valuable resource. Here on the forgotten shore, shards were a form of currency among the sleepers. 100 of them was an unimaginable amount. After a lifetime of being a pauper, Sonny was finally rich. Money, I have so much money! If a person wanted to live inside the castle walls, they had to pay a tribute of 1 soul shard every week. Those who could not afford it were forced to remain outside, living in a makeshift settlement just beyond the gates, which was often attacked by the monsters. Even so, they had to pay for food or go out and hunt themselves, which more often than not led to their deaths. With how much Sonny had gathered in these 3 months, he would have been able to live in the comfort of the castle for years, if he wanted to. Which, of course, he did not. Why would he pay for accommodations when he already had a palace of his own? One with no noisy neighbors and a fearsome guardian protecting the premises, no less. Putting 2 new soul shards in the chest, Sonny glanced at his dragon hoard one last time and closed the lid with a satisfied smile. Perhaps it was time to visit the castle again and buy a few things. No. He had already bought everything he needed the last time. Spending too many shards would make people doubt that he was as pathetic as everyone thought he was. Of all the sleepers in the castle, only 3 people knew that he was not just good at hiding in the shadows and avoiding danger. They were Nephice, Cassie, and Castor. That damn bastard. Chapter 101 Turf War. Castor had been lucky enough to enter the dream realm near the city and arrive at the castle much earlier than the 3 of them. By the time Sonny, Nephice, and Cassie had found their way to the human settlement, he was already in good standing there. Despite the fact that there were a lot of opportunities for a talented legacy to rise through the ranks of Gunlog's army, he had nevertheless decided to remain independent and eventually join the Changing Stars cohort, drastically raising their combat strength and reputation. Looking back, that was when all of Sonny's problems had really started. That's right, it was all his fault, not mine. Yeah, definitely. Grinding his teeth, Sonny kicked the heavy chest and cursed under his breath. Then, acting as if nothing had happened, he smiled brightly and left the hidden chamber once again. Down below, things were getting interesting. Attracted by the smell of blood, several monsters tried to enter the ruined cathedral to feast on the fresh corpses. However, the Black Knight was as full of wrath as ever. Just as Sonny climbed onto the support beams, he was finishing off a large creature that looked like a praying mantis made of human skin. Initially, Sonny planned to take a look at the material possessions left behind by the 5 unfortunate thugs, but the sight of the ferocious battle made him change his mind. He would have to do it later. Besides, his shadow had already looked through the bloody remains and came to the conclusion that there was nothing really valuable among the dismembered corpses. Not wasting any more time, Sonny escaped through the roof of the cathedral and retraced his steps to the place where he had fought the Blood Fiend. The body of the hunting party's leader was still there. Of course, his memories had long disappeared, leaving the bearded man dressed only in rags. The heavy battle-axe was gone, too. Sonny sighed. That's why killing people is not worth it. His shadow covered its face with a hand and shook its head dejectedly, trying to express that his wording was nothing short of unfortunate. Sonny frowned. What? It's not. And for him, it was doubly so. When one awakened killed another, they received a considerable portion of the enemy's soul essence without having to shatter their soul shard. Sonny, however, was not an ordinary awakened. His aspect was based on consuming shadow fragments instead. That meant that even if his enemy had absorbed hundreds of soul shards in the past, Sonny would only receive the number of shadow fragments matching their rank and class, just like he would after slaying a nightmare creature. Since all sleepers were mere dormant beasts, in this case, the number was 1. Just 1 fragment away from 400, Sonny said, a bit disheartened. All that work for nothing. Some small, rational piece of his mind was actually relieved that killing humans was not very lucrative. Otherwise, in his state, no, he wouldn't. Surely. Ah? Wouldn't what? Sunny blinked a couple of times, waiting for his inner voice to answer. However, it was strangely silent. Shrugging, he bent down and searched the dead man's body, hoping to find something of value. However, he was left disappointed. There was no pouch full of soul shards as he had imagined. All Sunny found was a strange piece of fabric that had been secretively tucked away into the tall thug's shirt. Looking at the fabric, he noticed crude shapes drawn on it with ink. Some shapes looked strangely familiar. Is that a map? Indeed, it was a primitive map. The shapes he recognized were the various landmarks located in the neighboring parts of the cursed city. Sunny knew many of them by heart, and had even explored a few in the past. A treasure map? Suddenly, the strange timing of the hunting party's arrival and their lack of experience made perfect sense. They weren't actually hunters. Instead, they were a bunch of fools who had been swindled by some smart person back at the castle into buying a fake treasure map. At least that was the most likely possibility. However, but what if it's real? Sunny blinked, looking at the map with a mix of distaste and avarice. He couldn't decide whether he should try and follow it or throw it away. Luckily, his thought process was interrupted by a thunderous crash. One of the buildings not far from where he was standing suddenly collapsed, filling the street with a cloud of dust and flying debris. A massive shape flew through the air and heavily crashed against another wall, causing an avalanche of stones to fall down. The creature tried to stand up, but then twitched and grew still, spilling rivers of fetid blood all over the pavement. It was unmistakably dead. Sunny quickly hid the map in his armor and dove into the shadows, trying to understand what was happening. Somewhere near, furious roars and the sound of steel clashing against steel could be heard, growing closer with each second. Strangely, there were no human voices. A battle between nightmare creatures? Such things were not rare in the Cursed City, but to Sunny's knowledge, there were very few things capable of challenging the current masters of this street and the adjacent square. These creatures were not the most powerful among the inhabitants of the city, but due to their unique characteristics, Sunny tried to avoid them like the plague. He saw several monsters much more powerful than anything he would be willing to take on, ending up sliced and diced into tiny pieces on that square. However, none of them was able to give the protectors of the square as much trouble as they were having right now, at least judging by the desperate sounds of the battle. Intrigued, Sunny decided to take a look. Hidden in the shadows, he climbed up the tall wall of an ancient building and soon arrived on its roof. Watching his footing, Sunny walked forward until he reached the opposite edge of the building. From there, he could see the wide square in all its dark glory. In the middle of the square, a moving statue was fighting against several hulking monsters. Chapter 102 Stone Saint. On a dark square surrounded by ruins of once magnificent buildings, a vicious battle was coming to an end. The remains of its solemn protectors were lying on the cold cobblestones, ruthlessly shattered into pieces. Sunny blinked in shock. They actually lost. He was really astonished. The living statues that used to guard the square were a very tough bunch. As far as nightmare creatures of the Cursed City went, they weren't the most formidable in terms of size and physical might. However, their strange bodies were extremely durable and capable of withstanding truly devastating amounts of damage. Aside from that, the stalwart stone warriors were also disciplined, proficient in the use of weapons, and utterly deadly. They were able to perfectly coordinate their movements, using strategy and tactics to silently overwhelm opponents whose power far surpassed their own. Countless monsters fell to their blades. That's why Sunny had always avoided getting into a confrontation with these weird creatures. Even though they weren't fallen by rank, the stone revenants represented a threat that was enough to make him wary. However, now the ownership of the square was about to change hands. The bodies of the previous masters lay shattered to pieces. In death, they looked just like broken statues. Even their metal armor and weapons had turned to stone after the wielders were destroyed. There were 5 or 6 of these stone piles scattered around the square, while the attackers seemed to have lost only 3 of their numbers, including the massive monster that had been sent crashing through a building earlier. Each body towered above the dark cobblestones like a small hill. The invaders were of a type of the nightmare creature that Sunny had never seen before. These new menacing monsters looked like giant spiders with bodies covered in thick plates of wrought iron. They moved with terrifying speed and force, sending cracks running through the cobblestones with each step. There were currently 2 of them left on the square, circling around the lone surviving stone warrior. The last of the living statues seemed to be a female. Compared to the spiders, she was almost comically small in stature, standing no taller than Sunny himself. The graceful stone creature was armed with a sword and a round shield, wearing a plate armor that covered most of her body, leaving only the eyes exposed. Or rather, 2 rubies burning with crimson flames that these creatures had instead of eyes. Her armor and weapons were black in color, forged from some unknown and incredibly heavy stone-like alloy. Of course, in reality, they were made out of the same stone as their wielder. However, the dark force that had turned the granite body of this nightmare creature into the strange approximation of flesh had also turned the stone armor into metal. Currently, the last of the living statues was standing with her shield raised, the blade of the sword resting on its rim. Her head was lowered, ruby eyes silently following the movements of the 2 spider monsters. Sunny didn't know for sure, but he suspected that these spiders were both fallen beasts. In any case, the stone woman was doomed. Her enemies were just toying with her, savoring the helplessness of their victim before finishing the job. He didn't really care. In fact, he was waiting for the show. Watching nightmare creatures slaughter each other was one of his favorite pastimes, and the best thing about it was that it didn't matter who won. Come on, get her! However, in the next moment, he was surprised. In a strange turn of events, the stone monster lunged at the spiders first. Calmly striking her sword against the rim of the shield twice, she dashed forward with grim determination. The spider she was aiming at was a second too late to react. However, due to its superior physical form, it was still able to meet the sudden onslaught with a vicious strike of its own. One of its legs shot forward, threatening to shatter the stone body of the attacking living statue into tiny pieces. The smaller creature deflected the blow with her sword and bashed the spider with the round shield, putting all of her weight and inhuman strength into the strike. Sunny blinked as the massive body of the fallen beast was thrown back and toppled over. The black sword immediately lashed out, sending a shockwave through the spider's guts. A rain of strikes fell on the iron surface of the monster's abdomen, filling the square with the clangor of metal. The stone warrior attacked with savage ferocity, using both the sword and the shield to inflict as much damage as possible in a short amount of time. Just as the iron plate protecting the soft innards of the monster cracked, the second beast joined the fray. The following bloodbath was nothing short of horrifying. Despite the fact that the spiders were much faster and stronger, the steadfast stone wraith kept up with them for a while. Her indomitable will and ruthless resolve were enough to give the fearsome creatures pause. Moving with the deadly precision of a bloodthirsty killing machine, the living statue completely disregarded self-preservation in favor of making her enemies suffer. It seemed as though she was determined to take them to the grave with her. Soon, the terrible wounds on her body accumulated, making the stone creature look like a vandalized piece of macabre art. However, the spiders were no better. Their fetid blood was spilling everywhere, painting the whole square red. Severed limbs and shards of cracked iron littered the ground, mixing with the shattered remains of the fallen stone warriors. Finally, one of the spiders fell heavily to the ground and twitched, drawing its last breath. The remaining beast lunged at the staggered stone monster, its countless eyes burning with fury. The round black shield rose one last time and then flew aside, torn away along with the right arm of the stalwart living statue. However, almost at the same time, the blade of her sword pierced through the massive beast's skull, ending its life just a moment before breaking apart and turning to stone. Sunny shook his head. What an impressive sight! A lowly awakened creature slaying 2 fallen beasts. Midnight Shard would have liked that fierce last stand a lot. Come to think of it, this was nothing short of inconceivable. However, the graceful stone warrior paid dearly for performing the bloody miracle. Staggering once again, she fell heavily to the ground, clearly done for. The battle for the ownership of the Dark Square was over. Nobody won.